This is Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. The United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia is complicated. When we hear about Saudi Arabia in the U.S. news, it's often in the context of oil, the war in Yemen, or Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post columnist who was murdered by the Saudi Arabian government in 2018. Beyond these stories, though, there are eras of historical context, hard questions, political developments, and personalities of leaders involved on both sides of the relationship. Many of us don't often have a chance to hear or learn about these things in depth. Jon Alterman is one of the country's top experts on all of these topics. He's a professor, director of the Middle East program at CSIS, and his opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, among others. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and Jon Gunnison talked to him all about U.S. Saudi relations, developments within the kingdom, and what's likely to happen going forward from here. For more information and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So, Dr. Alterman, President Biden has an upcoming trip to Saudi Arabia, and it's coming at a time when domestically oil prices are high. They're high all over the world. But we also have an election coming up, and poll numbers now, it's beginning the horse race on the U.S. media channels. So it feels like this meeting is really, really important. Can you tell us what President Biden is trying to accomplish going over to Saudi Arabia right now?
I think he's trying to do a lot of things, and only some of them have to do with gasoline prices. Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries in the world that has what they call spare capacity to pump oil. If they want to turn the taps open a little bit wider, they could. Really, only they and the United Arab Emirates can do that right now. Everybody else is pretty much producing whatever they can, and still the world is a little bit short of oil. Now, part of that is because of Russia, but it's more complicated. It has to do with the fact that demand has kicked up after demand plummeted during COVID. But I think the president's agenda is actually a lot broader than just talking about oil prices. He's interested in the Iranian nuclear program and proliferation in the Middle East. He's interested in security for Israel. He's interested in renewable energy. And Saudi Arabia is in an interesting position when it comes to the world's transition to cleaner energy. The Saudis are looking for a lot of things from the United States, and that means that the president has opportunities to get things from Saudi Arabia. But I think there's going to be a political hit that the president's going to take, partly because there are a lot of people in the United States who were very critical of Saudi Arabia, whether it's because of Saudi senior officials' involvement in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, to political repression, lack of free speech, to the repression of gays and lesbians in the kingdom, religious freedom issues, the war in Yemen. I mean, there's a long list of reasons why different groups of Americans are very, very critical of Saudi Arabia. And there's already some criticism that why is the president giving legitimacy to a government which he said during the campaign should be treated like the pariah that they are?
John, it seems to me a little bit that the current U.S. administration is very reluctant to even try to make the case to the American public that the relationship with Saudi Arabia matters and is worth preserving. Famously, President Biden made that pariah comment that you've suggested, that you've referenced, I should say. But also in the lead up to this visit, he's been a bit dodgy about whether he's even going to have a formal meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed or even King Salman. He's been saying it's not really a visit to the KSA, it's a visit to the Middle East that happens to be in the KSA. Maybe I'll meet one of the principals on the sideline of the conference. There doesn't seem to be an effort to really try to communicate to the American public all the reasons that you've just said about why this relationship is an important one worth preserving. Do you agree with that assessment?
You know, I honestly haven't been following the press statements that closely. And I think, frankly, a lot of Americans are preoccupied with other things, whether it be gasoline prices or gun control or abortion or any number of things that have been inflation, all the things that are taking up bandwidth in the United States. I saw somebody from the White House over the weekend. I asked about, is there going to be a photo of the president and the crown prince? And I said, yeah, I mean, they're going to be in the same meetings. I'm sure that the crown prince is going to come over and extend his hand, and the president is going to be in that position. And I think they've sort of taken it as a given that it will happen. There's a difference between politics and government sometimes, that politics is what's popular and what people support, and government is kind of what has to get done. I think what happened as the president and his advisors looked around the world and said, what do we need to do to advance the interests of the American people? They came up with a really long list of things that are much easier to do when the Saudis are trying to support you and much harder to do when the Saudis are trying to undermine you. And they felt that having recalibrated the relationship from the Trump administration, which they felt was overly warm, overly cozy, that maybe they overcorrected a little bit, and giving some form, some positive form to what the relationship was and should be, would advance American interests. The administration went out last fall, and Brett McGurk, who's the Middle East coordinator on the National Security Council, kept talking about how the United States was aligning its goals and its resources in the Middle East. That is, the United States was not going to swing for the fences and try to change the Middle East on a penny pincher's budget. And that what we're going to do is we're going to have more modest goals, more modest expectations to align with our more modest resources as we focus our efforts on Asia. What people in the Middle East heard that to be is there's actually nothing we care about. We're willing to get out and not spend anything and not get anything, so we really don't care. I think that's not what the president wanted to communicate. And I think what you're seeing, and I had some conversations with senior folks in the White House about this, there needs to be a positive agenda. There needs to be something you actually say you are for, and not just say, you're not for this, you're not for that, you're not for this, you're not for that, because then people assume you're for nothing. And so I think this is, frankly, the appropriate thing to do. The world continues to rely on Middle Eastern energy. Proliferation is a big concern, and perhaps nowhere more than the Middle East. You could argue also North Korea, but I think they're co-equal. Security of Israel has been very important to a lot of Americans for a very, very long time. So you could argue that there are a lot of things the U.S. really does care about in the Middle East, even as it is rebalanced toward Asia. And having a dialogue with one of the most important countries in the region is important. And, it's worth remembering, among the people urging the president to engage more with the Saudis were the Israelis, who don't have a diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia, but think that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia aligning more on common interests advances Israeli national security.
In the lead up to the trip, John, it seemed as though the administration were making kind of the last point that you made, that a lot of the reason why Saudi Arabia matters is because of Israeli security. It's something that they emphasize quite a bit. They're talking about the deal that they've made with Egypt to transfer the possession of islands, talking about the airspace deal, and emphasizing the possibility that a little bit further down the road, we could see some kind of formal recognition and normalization between Riyadh and the Israeli government. But I wonder if this is enough. Isn't it important to make the rest of the case? I wonder if the Saudis might be a little disappointed that so much of what we're trying to communicate to the American public about this relationship has to do with a third country. Isn't the positive agenda, shouldn't it be focused a little bit more on the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia itself?
I was in Saudi Arabia last month. I didn't hear any of those complaints, frankly. I was in Saudi Arabia also in November. And in November, Saudis were preoccupied with a concern that their principal security guarantor seemed not to be very sympathetic to their security concerns and seemed to be looking for the exits. And that went from ranging from a sense of abandonment to a sense of concern to a sense of anger. But there was a lot of emotion that I sensed in November in Saudi Arabia. What do we have to do to get the president to engage? When I was there in June, there's a recognition, okay, the president's going to engage with us. We do matter. We do have this historic partnership. One of the things that what I've been hearing from the U.S. side and the Saudi side is the language of we're building the foundation of a relationship for the next 70 years. And that, I think, has implicit in it a sense that we're moving beyond the old relationship of security for oil. And it's going to be more comprehensive. It's going to be partly about the really dramatic transformations going on in the kingdom now, because the kingdom knows it has to diversify its economy. Does the U.S. have a role to play in that? I think Saudis say absolutely yes. Will Saudi Arabia have to change in important ways? I think Saudis and Americans say absolutely yes. How much role the governments will play, how much role you'll have private sectors playing a role, I think is interesting and important. And I think also, if you're in the Biden administration and you're thinking seriously about what a global energy transition looks like, that looks a lot different if the Saudi government is partnering with you or the Saudi government is trying to fight you tooth and nail on every issue because they're trying to extract the last iota of value they can get because they think that you're crazy. And if you can get some synergies, again, we have different interests. We're not going to agree on everything. But if we can sort of align the big muscle movements, that can be a big boost to a climate agenda, which the president's really serious about.
I think that at this point, we've outlaid a lot of the reasons why policymakers in Washington have been pragmatic about the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And you described about how there's an interest in laying out a roadmap for 70 years of common agenda together. But a threat to this is something that you referenced earlier, which is the public opinion in the United States, which is quite negative about Saudi Arabia. Certainly, there's been a lot of coverage in the media about the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. There's been, for decades, coverage about the often negative human rights situation in the kingdom. And we've seen how this has pulled on many members of Congress to take a more confrontational stand with the kingdom. At the same time, we have this pragmatism in Washington about all the reasons the relationship matters, which we've been talking about. And I'm wondering if this gap is sustainable, whether this topic can continue a bit divorced from public opinion, or whether it's inevitable that public opinion is going to cause a drift in the security-making, policy-making apparatus in Washington. Do you think that we can continue in this way, or do you think that there's going to be a little bit more convergence between public opinion and pragmatic Washington opinion, and in which direction would that convergence be?
So it's interesting because, to my mind, the principal criticism of the relationship is this is just a mercenary relationship. You're in it for money, right? You're in it because you want cheap oil. You're in it because you want to sell weapons to these hateful people. You're in it because you want big contracts. You want consulting contracts. You want whatever. That you're selling your values for money. And that's distasteful. This sort of got extra energy in the Trump administration when there was a perception that the president had an unseemly close relationship with the Saudis, and the president and his family sought personal economic rewards for doing so. So I think that there's sort of like that piece, and I think it's the distaste of doing it for money that makes it sort of especially morally offensive. The story that Saudis often tell, and especially young Saudis will tell, is this is a country in the throes of tremendous transition. Saudi Arabia has about 50% higher female participation in the workforce between 2018 and 2021. 50%. It's now sort of on par with a country like Colombia, which we don't think of as a place where women are oppressed. There is tremendous diversity and personal expression in Saudi Arabia, not on political issues, but on social issues. They had a big rave concert in the desert called Middle Beast, which had the LGBT community out visibly in force. You know, I think what especially young people in Saudi Arabia say is we are working for a different society. A lot of them, not all of them, not even majority of them, but a lot of them came to the United States to study over the King Abdullah Scholarship Program in the early 2000s after 9/11. They say, think what you want about the government. There's a Saudi people here who you need to engage with. Interesting things happening. Why can't we build on that? And, and the government's saying, well, let's build things together. Let's cooperate. Let's get American investment for these things. Let's develop tourism. Where the story comes out is unclear to me. I think there is certainly a reform story in the kingdom. There's a repression story in the kingdom. There's a money story. There's a rising generation story. And I think, frankly, different people are going to latch on to different parts of the story. When I was in Saudi Arabia in March 2018, I met this really thoughtful guy, and we were talking about change in Saudi Arabia. I was struck because the conversation was partly in English, partly in Arabic. He wasn't totally comfortable having conversation in English. He read English with some difficulty, but he wanted to read a lot. And I came away from the meeting and saying, wow, this is a place that's really in the throes of change. And this guy is the kind of person who can make it happen. 2 months later, he was arrested and put in jail for supporting the women's rights protest. He is still in jail. Okay. So I think, to me, Saudi Arabia is about this tension. It's not all one thing. It's not all about repression and sort of forcing people to conform. It's not all about buying people off and getting people to act as mercenaries. It's not all about liberalization. It's kind of all those things at once. And that, I think, gives different people different opportunities to plug in different ways. I think there's some things that we find incredibly encouraging, some things we find repulsive, some things we can change, some things we can't change. And I think it just, it's something we're going to have to feel out with each other and with different Saudis. And certainly there are going to be Saudis we're going to want to work with and Saudis we're not going to want to work with.
On October 2nd, 2018, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. It would be the last time he was seen alive.
We turn now to the disappearance raising alarms around the world. A Saudi journalist, a Washington Post contributor.
Saudi Arabia's crown prince told Bloomberg he has no idea what happened to Khashoggi.
The Central Intelligence Agency has already told the president who they think is accountable. They believe that Mohammed bin Salman likely ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
They have nothing definitive, and the fact is, maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
Ignoring the findings of America's intelligence services and coming to a conclusion that is totally unsupported by the facts makes no sense. It's a big mistake. The Trump administration has got this wrong.
Jamal Khashoggi's murder is going to be a long-term stain on this relationship, appropriately so. And we're not going to forget it, but it also shouldn't prevent us from doing things. I mean, I remember the conversations I had with Jamal Khashoggi, and he was very supportive of the kinds of changes the kingdom is going through. He said 90% of what the crown prince wants to do is the right stuff. And the problem is, how do you work through the remaining 10%? And how do you engage society in conversations to refine the ideas to get buy-in? Jamal Khashoggi saw the promise and necessity of Saudi social transformation, but had basically a process problem. And for that, he was murdered. So if you don't feel conflicted, you're not paying close enough attention. And you should feel conflicted, but you shouldn't turn away and just say, oh, these people, they want to make us into whores.
That's a pretty clear way of saying it. The world is a messy place sometimes. So I just wanted to follow up on liberalization. Before I do that, though, friend of the show, Aaron David Miller, and friend of Khashoggi.
Friend of mine.
Yeah, he had a similar take, by the way. Almost said the same thing about that god-awful murder and how we need to move forward. I do want to get to the PIF and Kushner and Trump and domestic politics here, but you said something that sparked interest. And you mentioned this concert and how there was support for the LGBTQ movement, or the movement was at least out in public. So I'm wondering, I know that the current regime doesn't have favorable attitude towards LGBTQ people. And in authoritarian governments, usually there's feedback deficit where they're not taking input from their citizens. Is there any chance where we will see liberalization, for example, in the LGBTQ movement, because the young people in the Saudi society really want it, they start advocating for it, and the government actually listens? Or is that just not how cultural and social change works over there like it does here? Like, we see the murder of George Floyd, people get really upset, millions of people protest, and then slowly change begins to happen. How does it work over there?
Well, it's changing. So one of these things is particular to the Gulf, I think, and one of them is more broadly applicable to authoritarian governments. I think the governments in the Gulf, Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf, whatever you want to call it, have put a lot of effort into both understanding and shaping public opinion, especially through social media, through focus groups, through polling. I think they sort of think that they have figured out how to judge where the population is without elections. How well they've done that, how well they can shape it, if they want to shape it, I don't know. But I think over the last 10 years, since the Arab Spring, they've put a tremendous amount of energy into trying to figure out where folks are and have thoughtful conversations about where do we need to open up and where do we need to crack down. Right. And obviously the Arab Spring was an example where they sort of tried to rush and crack down and many of them lost everything. So that's one thing is I think that they're paying a lot of attention to where attitudes are on this issue. And certainly on issues of gender segregation and women's roles and all sorts of things, they have explicitly opened the space for diversity of views. And in fact, there is some concern that women in Saudi Arabia who choose to fully veil the way that women did 10 years ago are discriminated against because they're seen as not being modern enough or something. So I think there's an interesting process where the government is monitoring what attitudes are and is cautiously opening up as they sometimes choose to open up. I also think that there's a way that authoritarian governments, often in coordination with Russia, are trying to use LGBTQ issues as a way to push societies away from liberalism. That these people are trying to groom your children. I actually had a Saudi with, I think, a straight face tell me that by 2050, all of our children will be gay because of these efforts, right, to groom children. Also, this Saudi, by the way, listened to Fox News on his radio in his car. But I think there's a broader effort, and I think it's governments and political movements, and I certainly think the Russians are part of this in their effort to build resistance to the United States and to its allies, to use LGBTQ issues as a wedge between broader liberalization and the population. I'm not sure how that all plays out. I think there's no question in my mind that there is a lot of people who have found the internet to be an incredibly liberating way to see themselves in the world. And in a world where you can translate everything, with machine translation, and I think there's nobody who can be prevented from thinking of themselves in different ways, and that's certainly happening there. What the interface is going to be between what the law is, how the law is enforced against whom and when, and how people behave, I think is going to be a moving target. My guess is that for quite some time, we're going to be unhappy for where that balance is. But I think, frankly, I look around the United States, and I think a lot of Americans are uncomfortable with where the balance is, and something is too far to one side and something is too far to the other. But, when you talk to an 80-year-old, right, they sort of can't begin to fathom where 20-year-olds are. And I talk to 20-year-olds, and sometimes I can't fathom where 20-year-olds are. So I just think that this is a broader change in humanity, which is partly brought about by the way we relate to groups in our broader context and the way people think of themselves and the kinds of things people are exposed to and the kinds of way people are allowed to try on roles and explore. And I think, frankly, we're all going through it. We're not going to go through the same way. We're not going to go through at the same pace. But I think this issue is going to be a salient issue in Saudi Arabia. And I think they're going to take a different course than we have. But I'm not sure that there's not going to be my guess is there'll be a lot of change in that space. As I say, one of the interesting things about Saudi Arabia is one thing what the law says, and then there's what's enforced. And as I said, I spoke to some people who are at Middle East, and they said it was pretty unambiguous and it was allowed.
Since we're talking about liberalization, I'd like to put something to you about patterns of liberalization and what I think is an incorrect assumption that many people here in the West often make about how liberalization works. And I think that assumption is that the different categories of liberalization exist on a single spectrum. That political liberalization, economic liberalization, religious and social liberalization all exist together and accompany one another on a single journey. And I think that this assumption was often incorrectly applied in the case of China, where Western expectations were that as China economically liberalized, it would then in turn socially and politically liberalize. And it seems to me that the KSA is another case that challenges this assumption, because we've seen how Saudi Arabia has socially, religiously, and also economically, for example, with the partial privatization of Aramco, the interest in foreign direct investment, diversification of the economy, that they're also economically liberalizing in some ways. But this hasn't accompanied a political liberalization. And in some sense, the social and religious liberalization has actually served political centralization, because the religious authorities that compete for power in the kingdom have had a reduced sense of power under Crown Prince Mohammed. It seems to me that, in fact, the political authority is becoming stronger and more centralized at the same time that this social liberalization is happening. And this is something that's surprised or has been very difficult for many Westerners really to comprehend.
So I think there's been a lot of muddying of what liberalization means. And that's part of the problem. The argument that Saudis make, or the argument the Saudi leadership makes, is that there has to be a period of strongly guided opening up, or the conservative forces will drag it back down to conservatism and undermine change. You would not be wrong if you compared that to the dictatorship of the proletariat, where all the communist states were supposed to be free once they got rid of all those nasty capitalists who were still hanging around. That didn't work out too well. I think you're right that at this point, these are societies that believe strongly in top-down change, in repression of people who don't agree and won't get with the program, but are increasingly accommodating of difference. And there are ways in which you're allowed to be different and ways in which you're not allowed to be different. And how much that changes over time and what they allow is open for negotiation. But, the question is whether this is sort of a way station to somewhere else or whether it's an end state. And I think that's frankly not determined yet. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in Saudi Arabia. I think, to my mind, when I was here on this last trip, one of the things that struck me is how much more poorly organized these efforts are at liberalization, modernization, economic diversification. You have people falling all over each other, people tripping each other, people undermining each other. Everybody's trying to nail down their key performance indicators and undermining somebody else's key performance indicators. So it seems to me that the piece of Saudi Arabia we get wrong is assuming that there's a Wizard of Oz sitting behind the chair, pulling all the strings and making everything happen. And when I've spoken to people involved in Vision 2030, their overwhelming interest is in breaking the sclerotic system that they think has to be broken. And they think good things will come from that. Now, you could argue that was the same ethos that guided the U.S. effort to push Saddam Hussein from power. And people said, there's nothing worse than this. And then you get all the chaos that followed the U.S. occupation of Iraq. I mean, maybe the theory's right. Maybe the theory's wrong. Maybe it's going to lead toward greater openness and greater individual freedoms. And maybe it'll break down. But I think, the way I see it, it's you have a group of somewhat headstrong younger leaders who say, we've got to roll the dice here. And anybody who takes it as anything other than rolling the dice is being naive. And I think from a U.S. perspective, the question you have to ask is, do we care how this experiment comes out? And I don't think we should insulate them from their mistakes. But I also think there's a legitimate argument to try to encourage their better angels and encourage the more positive things to move in that direction. So I think it helps us.
So I wanted to quickly pivot back before we go to 2030. And this is really a bugbear for my co-host, John. And it's the Kushner's relationship with Saudi Arabia, MBS, and how this could impact domestic politics here. So looking at the Democratic Party, you have progressives like Rep. Omar and other progressives that aren't big fans of Saudi Arabia. You have Senator Schumer, who I believe in 2016 actually, introduced a bill about 9/11 and suing Saudi Arabia against President Obama's wishes. So that's the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, you have what it seems like the Saudi Arabia from the PIF fund making a $2 billion insurance payment to Kushner's affinity partners in case President Trump comes back into office. So that is all to say, does Saudi Arabia run the risk of getting too far into partisan politics in the United States?
I think the Saudis run a serious risk of not building enough partnerships on the Democratic side and getting too comfortable with Republicans, partly because Republicans aren't always going to be in power. But also, as you suggest, I don't think it helps them to be perceived as meddling in U.S. politics, because I think it's very difficult for foreign governments to do that and get away with it. Exactly what the Kushner-MBS relationship is unclear. There are claims that Kushner advanced MBS's interest in the U.S. government, that he protected him against U.S. government punishment. There's the whole role President Trump played. It's sort of unclear what the facts are. I mean, the facts are knowable. I don't know them, of what Kushner knew and what he transmitted to MBS when MBS moved against the previous Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Nayef. But it does seem to, there's something broader, which is U.S. government officials should not be acting in ways where they use their official office to advance their personal interests. And whether it's future business interests, past business interests, whether it's the prospect of future reward, for 246 years, we've had a tradition of national service. The point of serving in government has been, especially in the last century, not to advance your personal interests, but to advance the nation's interests. And it does seem to me, and I've spoken to some former U.S. government officials who are quite offended at the idea that somebody would use an official position to advance a personal position after leaving office. I mean, I spoke to a former U.S. ambassador who said that when she went to FedEx her tax returns, she declined to use the embassy rate for FedEx to send in her taxes because she thought it was inappropriate to benefit in any way from her U.S. government position. That's different from setting up affinity partners with a bunch of former U.S. government officials and eliciting investments from people you were just dealing with as government officials. And it's also different from traveling around your last month in office to try to tee up some of those investments.
Candidate Trump took a harsh line on the kingdom,
We protect Saudi Arabia. Why aren't they paying?
He attacked Hillary Clinton for her ties to a country he called a criminal enterprise.
These are people that kill women and treat women horribly, and yet you take their money.
But as president, he charted a different course. One person was usually in the room, his son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner.
A $2 billion investment that former President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, secured last summer from a fund led by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has raised questions about the ethics of post-White House business dealings. Kushner's private equity firm secured the investment after Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman overruled a host of objections from the sovereign wealth fund's advisors. The New York Times reported some of the group's concerns. The private equity firm was found to be, quote, unsatisfactory in all aspects. The kingdom would be taking on the bulk of the investment and the risk. There was a seemingly excessive asset management fee and public relations risks due to Kushner's involvement.
I think that I might have shared this on our program maybe one other time previously, but part of my interest in the way that Kushner and his family interacted with the sovereign wealth funds is in part because me and a family member of mine were living on either side of the UAE-Qatar blockade line. And the blockade of Qatar occurred after the Kushner family were rejected an investment from the QIA, the Qatari Investment Authority. And it seemed as though it was possible that Kushner's antagonism towards the Qataris was in part inspired by the fact that his family had been rejected their application for financing. And that was something that affected me personally. And it was offensive to me that, just like you said, John, there was a person in a position of public service who might have been influenced very much by his family's own financial prospects.
Well, John, I think that's a reason why it's important that there not be an appearance of impropriety when you enter government service. The tradition has long been that you either put all your holdings into a blind trust that you try to do everything you can to avoid any appearance that any of your private interests would affect your public actions. And we still don't know exactly why Jared Kushner was denied a security clearance until the president insisted he be given one. That's the president's prerogative. But when he went through the process, he was denied a clearance. And we don't know why, but it may have been for reasons like that you can't separate his significant financial interests from the things he could affect by being in power and the possibility that he'd try to advance his personal interests rather than national interests. As I say, I mean, public service is that. It is public service. It is not about trying to maximize what you can make. It's trying to maximize the interests of American citizens and all of the American citizens, not just ones who share your last name.
We'll get off this soon. I think it will lead into what we want to ask next about Vision 2030. But I was wondering whether the governors of the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the PIF, made the investment in Affinity Partners with the QIA experience in mind, because they saw how denying the Kushner family financing when they requested it led to these adverse outcomes for Qatar, perhaps.
It's unclear. You know, the story that was reported was that there were people on the board who said this is inappropriate, and the word came down and said, do it anyway. So, you know, whether that's true, why it happened, what was going through somebody's mind, I mean, that becomes very hard. A lot of speculation goes into that. But, you know, somebody who's been around public service for almost 40 years, the idea of using your jobs to feather your nest is really offensive. I mean, and it's a blurry line, because certainly there are people who've served and they have expertise, and people want to draw on that expertise. But that's different from using up your official position to create a framework for your post-government position. That just strikes me as really beyond the pale.
I suppose that, just like you said, John, we're getting into a bit of speculation if we're trying to determine an exact motive, but we can certainly say that the facts that are apparent do create at least the perception of impropriety, and that's a problem in and of itself. But I think when we're talking about the way that PIF are investing their money, it does bring us to this topic of Vision 2030, which is Prince Mohammed's plans to try to transform and diversify the Saudi economy to a post-petroleum future.
It's McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group's plan, which he has inspired and paid for, right?
Yeah, indeed. But it's certainly in the public imagination, it's often been so associated with the Crown Prince. And I suppose that most of 2030 was devised well before the pandemic. And it's interesting to kind of take stock at this point and ask you, Jon, based on your assessment, do you think they're on track? 2030 is getting pretty close. How are they doing?
As I say, I think you're too young, and probably most of your listeners are too young to think a lot about angioplasties. But this is, when a blood vessel leading into the heart gets filled with plaque and they have a little balloon that expands and sort of breaks this blockage. And I think that's the way the Crown Prince and the people around him came to see the Saudi economy. It was reliant on the government having everybody on the government payroll, and about 80% of Saudis in the workforce work for the government. It is the principal driver of economic activity. It's the principal source of government income is the oil business. And you look forward and you say, well, we can't do this forever. And we have to have some sort of reasonable, diversified economy. And we better start now because it's going to take decades to make that transition. Arguably, the Emiratis have been doing this for a long period of time. You used to live in the Emirates, and you know this. The Emiratis, partly spurred by the example of Dubai, have said we have to transform Abu Dhabi. We have to be involved in a wider range of activities. We have to get people off the government payroll. We have to encourage investment. We have to do all these kinds of things. And I think the Saudis, whose economy is 4 times the size of the UAE's economy, although they have about 20 times the number of citizens, said we have to make this change too. So how do we do it? And we do it by setting up a lot of very ambitious goals and pushing people and breaking stuff and breaking that calcification and empowering people and engaging young people. And as I say, they've used sort of social media and other polling tools to channel into what young people think and want and getting them engaged and creating a real cohort that supports what they're trying to do. And I think their feeling is a combination of breaking the old stuff and seeding enough new stuff. And you can have a much better situation, whether it's 2030, whether it's 2040. I think all this stuff is hard. They've, one of the things that makes it harder is the politics of how you make a transition. Because when you make a transition like that, there are going to be a lot of losers, right? People who said, I had a really comfortable life, everything was guaranteed, and now I'm less comfortable and nothing's guaranteed. So what do I do with that? You had people who feel ideologically like they've been abandoned. And that turns to anger. We see that some in the United States where people, in rural areas arguably have said, the economy's moved away from me. I have no idea. I mean, you start talking about LGBTQ stuff. What the heck's that about? I mean, we have some of that in our country. And you could argue that there's a similar process ahead in Saudi Arabia as they diversify the economy and change the role of women in society and become more intellectually and socially diverse, that some of the old structures and old power structures and powerful people are going to get alienated. And the Saudi instinct is often, well, we can just co-opt those people. We'll keep them on the payroll. We'll do whatever, right? I mean, there's enough money to go around. Yeah, that's a problem that can be solved with money, and money we got. The Saudis have $500 billion in the bank for something like 20, 25 million citizens. So, their challenge is, how do you keep up the pace of change, inspire people? How do you insulate the losers from getting too grumpy, but not insulate them so much that they're not incentivized to change? So it's kind of a messy balance. And then, ultimately on a practical level, one of the big problems they have is if you're trying to do all these things, who are the managers who do it? And Saudi Arabia hasn't created a large managerial class. They've often had foreign managers managing foreign workers. So if you're trying to do all these things with more Saudis and get more Saudis into the workforce and train up more Saudis to be managers, there's kind of a shortage of Saudis who can be catalysts for the kinds of change you want to make and what that change looks like and what part of it's genuinely Saudi and what just feels imported. So it feels to me like there's all this complication. What would seem to be really straightforward, and the consultants drop really clear documents and through all these steps, and here are the measurements of the steps, and here that's what consultants do. But when you actually try to implement that on a population of, let's say, 25 million or so, 25 million Saudis, who some people are really supportive, some people are really hostile. The hostile people, the haters, are mostly watching themselves. You could argue that's good or bad, but it's complicated and success is not at all guaranteed.
So I want to end on this question. It might be two wrapped into one for you, but I've always been very interested in this because not knowing too much about Saudi Arabia, and I think about it through the partisan political lens of U.S. voters, that it matters for every election because of the price of gas, and that can control elections. And, gas deals with food prices and inflation and all these things. But more specifically, we recently, and I think you touched on this, we recently had press reports of President Macron being overheard telling President Biden that he spoke with MBZ and basically the UAE couldn't produce much more energy and Saudi Arabia was in a similar boat. So this is a two-part question, I guess. Number one, is Macron right? Or is this just some type of diplomatic trick where he got roped in by his colleagues overseas? And then the second thing is, when you're President Biden or a U.S. administration official and you're sitting down and you're negotiating these things, and I understand energy is not separate from defense, is not separate from trade, but when you are really coming up against it politically and you do have energy prices going ridiculous around the world, what type of concessions will be offered, and what type of concessions does Saudi Arabia really want from the United States to go from 10.5 million barrels a day to 12.5 million barrels a day?
First, let me plug my own podcast, Babel, Translating the Middle East. Last week, I spoke to my friend Frank Verastro, who is an amazing oil industry expert, and he talked through what is possible and the likely impacts of what is possible. So you can get that from the CSIS website, css.org. We have a transcript, so you don't have to listen to the whole thing if you don't want to, but I encourage you to listen to the whole thing.
And everybody listening to this podcast, just go on the description and click on the link to Dr. Alterman's podcast right there.
So one issue is, what does spare capacity really mean? And how much could the Saudis produce for how long more than they're producing now? Maybe not 2 million barrels a day. How quickly could they get there? I think they probably have some ability, but there's a question of exactly how much more they could produce. There's also a question, if the world is headed into a recession, if you produce more oil, do you run the risk of once again having huge oil surpluses and the market tanking? And then you have another issue that the Saudis often harp on. I've certainly heard the Saudis complaining about it, that nobody wants to invest in oil exploration and production anymore because everybody's looking forward to the energy transition. But the fact is, if you want oil, wells become less productive every single year, and you have to keep putting money into the oil business. So this idea that you're going to have more oil, but not invest in the oil industry is crazy. So in terms of what the U.S. could give them, I think the U.S. could give them something on the production side, but probably not a lot for political reasons in the United States in terms of assurances, investment, whatever, encouraging investment, all those things. There's an argument to be made. The real problem is taking Russian oil off the market. There are different grades of oil. You could argue the main problem in the United States driving gasoline prices is a refinery shortage. And nobody wants to build refineries in the United States because of a sense that they're not going to be open long enough to get the return on the investment. So I think all these energy problems that we're in are really complicated problems. I think there's going to be some energy piece to this trip, but I think there's going to be a big security piece, partly involving Iran, partly involving Israel, partly involving Arab states joining together under U.S. leadership and getting that ball started. We've been trying to do it for a couple of decades and trying to reduce the American military presence in the Middle East. I think there's going to be a broader economic piece. There's going to be an energy transition piece. One of the big challenges with moving energy markets is that they're genuinely markets. And moving things, pulling levers, doesn't give you an immediate change. It can take months. It can take years for something to pay off. And so what you end up doing is you end up trying to predict where you'll be without knowing how you'll get there. And I remember about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there's a woman who used to have an annual meeting where people would gather and one of the things everybody did was say where energy prices going to be, where oil prices are going to be in a year. And invariably, the spread from one year to another was sort of within $3. So if oil was $14 a barrel, they said, well, it'll be $17 a barrel, it'll be $11 a barrel, but didn't go much beyond that. You got to next year, it's at $35 a barrel, right? And everybody can explain, everybody was wrong the last time, but where's it going to be now? Between 32 and 37, right? I mean, there's this way in which everybody looking into the future thinks that oil prices are going to be in a really narrow band. But in fact, oil prices can change dramatically, as we had, in the early weeks of COVID. You get paid $30 a barrel to take oil off somebody's hands. There are issues of grades of oil. Every oil isn't replaceable with another barrel of oil. U.S. refineries use certain kinds of oil, produce certain kinds of products. As the products you make from oil change, and petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizer, all these things are things you can take from oil. As that mix changes, that changes the oil you put in and what you get out. So all these things are really complicated systems, and we act as if it's the Saudis with a single hand and a single tap, and they can lower prices and raise prices. But in fact, it's a whole system, and that's why I think as the president looks to Saudi Arabia, he says everything with Saudi Arabia is complicated. Everything is. The energy stuff is complicated. The security stuff is complicated, whether it be with Iran or with Israel or anything else. The economic stuff is complicated. The human rights stuff is complicated. Yemen is complicated. We haven't talked about Yemen at all, right? But I think the Saudis have stumbled into a war that they can't get out of. And the Iranians are laughing every single day about how they suckered the Saudis into this adventure, and the Saudis can't figure out how to get out. So all this stuff is complicated, and I think the president came to the conclusion that, as Senator Simpson said when I was a staff member on the Baker-Hamilton Commission looking at the Iraq War, he said, no marriage ever got better when the couple decided not to talk to one another. And I think the president said, we have so many complicated issues with the Saudis. We got to engage with them, not because we're going to agree on everything. We're going to agree on a bunch. We're going to disagree on a bunch. We're going to try to set some parameters about what we disagree with and move this to a better place, because we have so much going on in the world, and Saudi Arabia remains an important and powerful country. And if you're trying to deal with it, you got to deal with it.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Dr. Jon Alterman, to CSIS, and to you for being here. For more information and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take 2 seconds to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode. This has been Politics and Media 101. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founders, Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, we hope to hear from you soon.